So the next speaker is been a friend of the Mid-Atlantic Collegiate Cyber Defense Competition for 6 years now as a red teamer. So take note, students that are here, Brad Bowers, bad guy. But he's also really been committed to the whole educational focus of the Mid-Atlantic CCDC. A couple years when we held this event at SAIC's new facility on 95, Brad did an interesting scenario around social engineering and the insider threat. At that facility, it was much smaller, and we had 3 camera crews constantly going in and out of various rooms. And that year, Larry Pesci, who's our last guest speaker, who's built the badges, physical access systems, the past now 3 years, had physical access badges around an RFID technology, and the students were really hyper vigilant about physical access and badging everybody. Yet Brad was able to blend in as a reporter for one of the film crews and individually interview students from the different teams, and what would appear to be, asking innocuous questions, but when combined in aggregate, yielded some interesting information that he then used to talk about in a debrief. He was good enough not to actually use that information against the blue teamers. So just an example of the ways in which Brad's been, contributing towards the educational value of these exercises. So I won't take up his time. Brad Bowers.
Right. All right. So we're going to be talking about wireless data exfiltration, basically building and using some of these low-cost tools that all of you as students or as yourselves or when you become red cell folks to use as part of your attack or assessment capabilities. And all of this is going to have a healthcare spin. And, thinking loud enough. Is there anybody who can't actually hear me? Do I really need to hold this mic? Whoa, apparently I do. All right, so all these slides were basically from 3 distinct presentations I've done, one at DEF CON, one at ShmooCon, and one just for some work elements. So we're going to go about a mile wide and about 6 inches deep, but stick with me. So how do you actually go next on this one? Wrong one? The one with the podium.
Yeah.
All right, we'll do it the old-fashioned way. All right, so who am I? My name is Brad. I'm just a guy who likes to play around with technology. Like Casey said, I've been playing Red Cell now for about 5 or 6 years, a long time. It's really what it comes down to. For those of you, I recognize a lot of the faces, but for those of you who I don't recognize or don't know me, if you'd like to know a little bit more about me, who I work for, what I do, you can throw my name into Google and you can find out some information. Well, I guess I shouldn't wander too far away. All right, so basic disclaimer. Everything that we're going to talk about, of course, is my own personal opinion, doesn't reflect those of the employers. And Darren, who works for the medical industry, I apologize up front for some of the content that you're going to be seeing, just as an information security professional, but I think you'll get a kick out of it. All of this is meant for education and hopefully a little bit of an entertainment purpose for you. And the goal is to make you think, right? We're going to take a look at a couple different technologies that, when used from a malicious perspective, can gain a lot of information. When used for their intended purposes, maybe not so much. We'll hit on that. On a little bit of a serious side, one of the components that we're going to talk about falls dangerously close to something called a dual-use munition. Well, what is that? Don't ask me how a signal receiving device can be considered a munition, but the point here is if you're going to try any of this stuff at home, make sure that you're following the appropriate laws and you're doing it with permission and all those things that we're always told to do. And of course, all the examples here were taken with permission. All right, so what are we going to talk about? The adoption of security in healthcare. I know I'm not the first one up here to say this, but it's going to be the primary focus. What we're really going to dig into is hospitals and why hospitals are a target-rich environment. We'll talk a little bit about how you guys can build some of these low-cost tools some low-cost wireless tools, and use them for your assessment purposes. We'll talk about the equipment, we'll talk about the testing methodology, a little bit about the analysis, and we'll go on. Ultimately, we're going to look at how can you apply that hacker's mindset to be able to make a piece of technology do something that was really never intended to do. All right, so I am probably, what, the sixth? How many presenters have been here today? 5 or 6, so I'm probably the 5th or 6th. I want to stand up here and tell you that healthcare is big business, right? Dr. Green really emphasized that. 2.6 trillion, and these were just some numbers that I pulled off of Google, but what it comes down to is lots and lots of money. So because there's lots of money in it, there's lots of regulatory and legislation, lots of rules that are applying to it. And also something that Dr. Green really hit on is the complexity. Now it's the complexity that's really going to be emphasized because it's because of those complexities that we have some of these security concerns. Not only is it the complex environment, but you get the sense that of how technology is being adopted. And I wanted to hit a little bit on that. The healthcare industry has this very interesting dichotomy. On the one side, you have this very quick need to adopt or use new technology, right? Now, these are the technologies that are being used to enrich our lives, to make things better for us. Well, on the flip side of that, it's the fact that we're adopting these technologies so fast that it's causing problems. I gotta grab the water. Apologize. So this rapid emergence of new technologies, lots of money going into it, lots of things to consider. And one thing that we're going to focus on is around the wireless and the immersion or the use of new wireless technologies. All right. So let's take a look at some of those wireless components. Specifically, we're not going to talk about the 802.11 technologies. Why? Well, because these technologies have been through the ringer. We know them, we've used them for lots of years, we know what their capabilities are. What we're going to focus on are 3 types. Some legacy technologies, being POXAG, which Dr. Green momentarily hit on. We'll talk about some of the current technologies, being Zigbee, RF-Link, along those lines. And then we'll talk about some of the emerging technologies. And we'll get into some of the more corporate-grade Madison and other capabilities. We'll talk about how these technologies are used, how we can test them, and ultimately, what we can do to learn about their functionality and make them do things that they were never intended to do. All right, so what does this doctor have in his hands? Anybody? Pager, right? So most of you are too young to remember when these were actually a fashion symbol. These were like the latest and greatest technology. If it was, like if you had one of these, that was it. It was the equivalent of today having like the iPad 3, a status symbol almost. Well, the problem is there's lots and lots of problems with this legacy technology. And Dr. Green called it archaic, and he's absolutely correct. That really very much emphasizes what this technology is. Well, the problem is it relies on some very old protocols that are used. And we're going to see how these protocols can be manipulated or ultimately taken information from to extract or exfiltrate some data. So a little bit about the devices itself. It uses something called POXAG, or Post Office Code Standardization Advisory Group. Now, this technology was born out of British Telecom, and it was designed for something very elegant back in the day, and that is the slow, very high sustainability or very high saturation of data. So the idea here is you can get small amounts of data over very large geographical areas. Well, just like any kind of wireless technology, if you're sending it out wirelessly over a large geographical area, it is susceptible to being intercepted and decoded. A little bit about the technology itself. It's 32-bit blocks of data, which gives you roughly 512 bits per second, 64 characters, grotesquely slow by any standard. And it uses something called frequency shift key modulation. So for those of you who've had a radio class or something like that, you've probably heard this before. But this technology is basically taking a carrier signal, shifting that frequency up a little bit or down a little bit to represent our ones and zeros. Pretty easy for someone with the right tools to be able to understand it, collect it, and potentially decode the information that is embedded in it. It works on all sorts of frequencies and different bandwidths. The most common that we see nowadays, and believe it or not, this technology is still unbelievably common, unbelievably used all throughout. And Darren, I'd be curious to know if you know a lot of hospitals are still using it today. Yes, all right. So there's been some predecessors. They all work relatively the same way, and I won't dig too deep into them. But Flex and Mobi also has the same capabilities. Again, the problem here is that it can be easily intercepted. How is it being used? Well, today, it's used to provide a really good function between doctors and nurses. This gives nurses the ability to respond or communicate with their doctors anywhere they may be, or if it's a closed system within their building. And they transmit everything that you would expect. In some cases, it's information about a patient. For example, Mrs. Smith isn't responding well to a medication. Dr. Green or whoever it may be, what would you suggest we do? And the doctor can respond back, change the medication, maybe lower it, raise it, whatever is the appropriate response for that. It's also used in some cases for kind of information sharing between rooms and the availability for equipment. An example would be that like a portable X-ray machine or other forms of technology where it's being used to let another doctor or somebody else know that the equipment is ready for use. Where it starts getting scary is that in some cases, not all, but in some cases, they use it for transmitting highly sensitive information about the patients. Now, Dr. Green mentioned something about HIPAA, and HIPAA is basically a regulation that says there must be some controls or understanding about what data is being said about us, how that data is being stored, how it's being communicated, and what is actually inside the contents of it. Well, unfortunately, you can get examples where some of that information will have some highly, highly sensitive patient information, and we'll see kind of what that looks like. Why is this able to be intercepted? Well, POCSAG was never designed with security in mind. It was designed to be able to get data to where it needed to go. We're also talking about a technology that's pushing 20 or 30 years. It's an old technology component. Now, while the data is obfuscated using this frequency shift key modulation, the reality of it is it's pretty easy for someone with some very low-cost tools to be able to collect and ultimately decode that. And I wanted to give you an example, not decoding it, but of what that would sound like. So some of you remember it kind of sounds like a modem noise, right? Well, that's basically the data going across. That's circling around us right now. You'd be able to collect some of that information in. But a lot of organizations try to do a good job of obfuscating the data by using some in-house encoding. So instead of saying year-old female, they'll use YO or something along those lines. And a lot of other organizations hide behind what's known the Electronic Communications Privacy Act, specifically 1825-10, which says that it is illegal to intercept national carriers when it comes to this type of messaging. It's not illegal to do it for closed systems. It is very immoral, of course, but not necessarily illegal. I kind of equate it to speeding. We're all told we're not supposed to be speeding, but the reality of it is people can and unfortunately will do it if they have the opportunity. So the ability to do this is actually pretty simple. You need a signal receiving device similar to that one over there. You need something called a data slicer. A data slicer is nothing more than a device that takes that frequency shift key modulation, decodes it, and puts it back into something that is human readable. The last piece you need is just to know what the frequencies are, and with a little bit of social engineering or just with a little bit of scanning, you can find them pretty easily. So I wanted to give you an idea of kind of what it looks like. Now, this is a snippet taken right off the HIPAA webpage. And I kind of put some arrows to highlight a couple key points. Basically, what it says is that the information that pertains to an individual about their diagnosis or about their condition needs to be contained and kept sensitive. Well, these were taken with permission and were examples that were provided to show that you can pull this right out of the air. Not a lot of tools. I can do it from miles and miles and miles away without the worry of being found. In the first example, you got a 29-year-old female named Jennifer, and I've kind of obfuscated out the name, but she's obviously having heart issues and potential seizures. Another example was an 82-year-old female who apparently fell and had some bleeding problems. So what you're seeing here is really just the tip of the iceberg. There's lots and lots of other examples of this. Many examples of even social security numbers being transmitted across. Patient policy data, home addresses, and the list goes on. I even have a collection of conversations between nurses and doctors that I'm pretty confident that if their spouses heard, they'd probably be following for divorce proceedings or something along those lines. Of course, not all organizations are transmitting information in the clear like this. Some do a much better job than others when it comes to not only securing that data, but making sure that it does not go out and is available for everyone else to look at. And what you get to is an underlying reason, and that is there's simply a general lack of understanding and a lack of kind of focus when it comes to some of these technologies. The cost or the focus is usually on emerging threats. Well, this is a technology that's old, archaic. It's been around for a very, very long time, and the reality of it is we shouldn't have to worry about this one anymore. But since it is one of those older technologies, it tends to fall to the wayside and sometimes may not be recognized as a potential risk. All right, so we're going to move on to another type of data collection. So who knows what this is? Anybody get one of these last year? There you go. So for those of you who didn't, this was the badge from last year's competition. And let me tell you, I go to a lot of information security conferences. This is by far the baddest ass badge you are ever likely to receive. I'm curious to see what we get this year, but really, really cool. And the reason why this device is so cool is that it has a lot of capabilities. We can build a packet collection device that is completely self-contained and has a lot of high functionality. We'll get into that. So a little bit about Zigbee, what it is and what it does. If you're unfamiliar with it, basically Zigbee is a personal area network tool. It is not designed to replace what we all have in our homes from a wireless perspective. It is only intended to be a tool for special interests or special functionality. In this case, sensors. I don't know if it was Dr. Green or one of the other presentations, but he talked about the adoption of some of these technologies, and Zigbee is actually one that's really, really getting up there. It's designed for low cost, short range. It doesn't push a lot of data, roughly 250 kilobytes, slow by any standard. It uses the same frequencies. I know I have up there 2.4, 868, and some 900. The reality of it is almost everything that you're going to see today, regardless if you're here or in another country, is going to be 2.4. It is the most common one out there. It automatically builds itself into a mesh or star topology. And the nice thing about Zigbee is that it has some built-in security. Security was actually part of the idea for this. So a little bit about how it's used in healthcare. Well, there's this organization called Continua Health Alliance. Stop me if I go wrong here. But what this organization does is they help build and design how technology can and should be integrated into the healthcare industry. Does that roughly grab it? All right. Now, the group comes up with some really good stuff, and one component that they came up with was the use of Zigbee technology for health device communication. And tons of uses, everything from fall sensors to the collection of data. In the old days, we see movies where the patient's on the bed and they have all these wires attached to them, and all these wires go back to the wall or something like that. Well, we're beyond that now. Now we can actually have all of it collected into these individual devices and just communicate wirelessly back to a device that sits on the wall. much easier for the patient, a better experience for them, and also an easier way of collecting the data. The problem you run in here is that there's lots of potential attack vectors. Zigbee was designed with security in mind, but only if it's used in the most stringent definitions. And in a lot of cases, it's not. And we'll kind of see how we can collect some of that. So your CCDC badge, like I said, it's an awesome platform to build on. And here's why. The badge is built around something called an Arduino microcontroller, which are wildly popular, lots and lots of them out there. And they have the capability to easily be modular, so you can plug things on top of them. So what I did with some help of some of the other Red Cell folks from last year is we built on top of that badge that we got from CCDC and expanded its capabilities with some very simple code and a low-cost component to add it on top. And I'll actually send it around if you guys want to take a look at it. But what we were able to come up with is a device that can wirelessly collect or interrogate other devices, medical devices, that are giving off Zigbee data, collect that information, and store it away without the use of a computer, without the use of having to worry about other power sources. It's all self-contained. And I have a couple pictures of it. So here's just basically what it looks like. The red thing that you're seeing on top there is actually what is known as a shield. And basically, this provides a micro SD card to collect the data. So the idea here, and I'll maybe get a kick out of that. The idea here is that we have a self-contained device that is capable of collecting this traffic. How we use it or what type of data we can collect with it depends on the environment. And I'll just say that you would be unbelievably surprised at the amount of organizations, places that have unencrypted data being transmitted across these. Now, I have not collected anything such as sensitive patient information, but usually sensitive information pertaining to maybe a patient, maybe to how a piece of equipment functions, things along those lines. Basically, the raw data that you get out of it is going to be able to be imported into Wireshark. Anybody have a question or not know what Wireshark is? All right. So it gets it into a very usable format. We did an experiment by just throwing it into a backpack and walking around the city. In fact, there's lots of websites that are kind of jumping on that bandwagon now where they geotag where open Zigbee points are. So to kind of wrap this piece up, surprising amount of unencrypted traffic that's out there, lots of interesting information. A problem here and why this becomes an issue is that Zigbee doesn't have any intrusion detection sensors today. It doesn't have a lot of those higher-end protocol components that we see on like networks environments where it can identify when, say, a session is being hijacked or when false data is being injected into it. It's not designed for that. And this kind of becomes interesting. And the little anecdote I have here about Anonymous killing a patient, of course, this is hyperbole, but I think you kind of get the point. By being able to inject information into these devices, which after all this, during the next couple days of competition, we can demonstrate, you can actually start to overlay traffic or basically replay traffic after you've manipulated it a little bit. Lots and lots of possibilities. And when we're dealing with equipment that's used to monitor lives or used to help people or monitor their well-being, it starts to get a little bit scary. Obviously, there's a general lack of understanding of some of the capabilities, and also just more research is really needed for some of these technologies. Okay. All right, so the last one we're going to talk about is Madison. Now, I don't know if our Army INSCOM folks are here yet. Not yet? Oh, okay. Well, this is something that they're actually really, really good at. In fact, it's something that they pride themselves on from an intelligence collection. These slides came from a project that I worked on for my real job where we had a simple premise, and that was, is it possible for someone to build a low-cost solution that has the capability of having the same functionality that something like a military would have? Could we come up with the same functionality, the same capabilities, and yet do it using some low-cost hardware? And that's really what we focused on. So some of you are saying, well, what the heck is this Madison thing? At its core, Madison's pretty simple. It is the collection of unintended emissions or byproducts given off of devices. Okay, so everything gives off these emissions. Our cell phones, our bodies, everything gives off this pattern, so to speak, that can be, one, uniquely identified, two, it can be measured, and three, it can be collected, and ultimately you can derive some intelligence from it. Hospitals, as you can imagine, use lots of these technologies that give off emissions, of course. We won't hit too much on that component. Madison in itself is considered a discrete intelligence process, and I'm running out of time, so I'm going to blow through these. There's lots of different versions of it. Obviously, we're going to focus in on the radio or RF components, but know that they're all there. This is the type of technology that is used to collect information and basically use what you get to help learn more about something. It's very often used in black box scenarios where you're trying to learn more about something that you may not be able to put your hands on physically. It's rapidly growing. This is an area within the corporate world, at least, especially when it comes to competitive intelligence, corporate espionage, things along those lines, is getting more and more prevalent. So, well, we were lucky enough to have somebody who was willing to be a guinea pig. Meet Bob. Well, Bob's got this really, really cool device on him, and it's called a cardio inverter high-energy defibrillator. And I'm sure you guys could tell me a heck of a lot more about it. But these devices are awesome. These help people, one, stay alive, but they also control the rhythm of their heart. And guess what? They're controlled by Zigbee and Bluetooth as their primary communication components. So this gentleman was actually telling us how he could go to the doctor's office and remotely she would be able to raise his heart rate or lower it or do some tests that he's physically feeling, all wirelessly. Well, this scares me a lot. But it gives you an idea of what some of the capabilities are and how some of these technologies are being used. By using our massing components, we can build a framework to test these devices, and we have. And we're not ready for prime time, but basically you can come up with a framework, a methodology to actually throw traffic at this device and see how it responds. And actually what they do is they beep inside your chest. When it gets close to a magnet, apparently they beep, and if it receives commands that it doesn't understand, it'll beep. At the end of the day, you can assess some of its functionality. We were able to figure out how this thing communicates by using some of these massing components. And I brought that up here too. I can show you guys later. But this goes for about $300 off eBay, as opposed to $50,000 or $60,000 you would have to pay for more of a formalized spectrum analysis equipment. All right, I'm going to go through this part quick. I'll give you a simple analogy. This capability is similar to watching two people that are talking a different language sitting in a room. Now, while you can't understand what they are saying, you can still derive a tremendous amount of information and intelligence about what's going on, even though you can't understand their language. You can understand, or if you see the individual again, you'll be able to identify them. You can tell if they're yelling at each other. Lots and lots of information. And that's pretty much what we're able to do with this massing components, is be able to identify, even though we can't listen to the encrypted information yet, we can actually collect the other components, learn about its capabilities. How far can this thing receive a signal? How often does it give off a broadcast? Lots of information that helps from a black box perspective. We can go a little bit into building it, but at the end of the day, it comes down to building and identifying very unique patterns. So we can uniquely identify the device that's been implanted. We can uniquely identify most radio devices. For this project that I did, it was really focused around handheld radios to see if we could track an individual, where they go, who they talk to, based off a radio that they carry with them all day. We're also trying with cell phones, just with the low-cost equipment. It's kind of tricky to be able to do that. How much time do I got, Casey? I'm done. Okay, so using a $300 roughly tool off eBay and a little bit of software, we were able to use some Python code, which a lot of you are learning in school, to be able to collect information about anything that gives off a signal. In this case, it was these Collegiate 100 defibrillators. In other cases, it could be another piece of technology. We built a method for actually being able to collect the data, being able to assess it, compare it against each other to find out if you're seeing a new device or a different device. At the end of the day, the point to kind of take away from this is that some of the massing capabilities that you can use for this technology for are becoming more and more widespread. In fact, in the information security space, this is starting to become part of our job. We're starting to look at some of these other more abstract technologies that kind of deviates from the more traditional server management or firewall management, things along those lines. Obviously, the masking capabilities offer some advantages to information security professionals. People who do pen testing for a living are starting to get into this. Looking over at Larry, because I know they do some pen testing work. To kind of tie all this together, guys, healthcare is big business, and obviously there's many unique challenges that need to be addressed. Sensitive data can often be accessed in ways that haven't really fully been considered. Even old technologies become something that must be reassessed continually. You can't just do it once and think that it's something that's never going to change over time. Not only do the laws change, but the technology or the ability for people to exfiltrate information from that continues to grow. The rate and adoption of information technology, especially in the healthcare thing, I think Dr. Green said this really well. It's going way faster than we can really keep up with it. It's going faster than us as information security people are being able to keep up with it. So that's really our challenge that we're kind of facing. And with that, I'll open it up for questions. Shoot.
Your last slide said that business managers beware the rate of adoption is faster than security professionals.
Yeah, so
what do you advise a business manager to do?
what I have found to be effective is if I stand in front of my CIO or my CISO, my security officer, and say, hey, look, watch this. And you do a live demonstration in front of them of something that is possible, you pretty quickly can get some dollars or some of the backing to be able to do things. And that's really what it's about, being able to have someone who can explain to the people that are making the business decisions, to have them understand that we need to put a little bit of money towards this, and here's why, here's the risk. When they can see it or feel it, then it becomes a little bit more real. Yeah.
A lot of the problems you're talking about come also from use of legacy equipment and older technology. As far as responsibility goes, Hannah, how much responsibility do you feel should be with vendors versus the users, the end users? You want to address that?
Well, I'm not so sure the vendors, in some of the cases, like the POCSAG, it's not the vendor's fault. The technology is doing what it is intended to do. It's not the hospital's fault. The hospitals are using a technology that, in its day, was the best thing, and it actually saves lives because they can very quickly respond to things. So I don't know the answer. That's a tricky one. I think consumers need to be better educated on what the risks are when they go to some of it. Yes?
Yeah, I'd like to follow up on that. I think it's instructive to understand how some of these medical devices come about. Not always, but often it's at the neighborhood holiday party that the doctor down the street meets the engineer around the corner, and they're discussing some medical problem, and the engineer says, I can solve that, and here's how. And so essentially the doctor or the medical device manufacturer has to weigh the relative risk of saving people's lives with the technology versus the risk of its being exploited by people, just as you've described. So in some ways, we have a responsibility as a security community of informing the larger community, just as this workshop is doing, so that the relative risk calculation takes into account what some of these real risks are. I think in those neighborhood party or cocktail conversations, it's not even on their radar to think about some of these exploits.
Very well said. You're absolutely right. Other questions? Go once, going twice. Thanks, folks.